She tore it in half right in front of everyone. A $2 million cashier's check, ripped clean down the middle, the two halves fluttering to the marble floor like they were nothing. The bank manager looked at the 64-year-old man standing across the counter, took in his faded work jacket and his scuffed boots, and she laughed. "People like you don't carry that kind of money," she said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. She thought she was destroying a piece of paper. What she was actually destroying was 40 years of quiet sacrifice, 40 years of a man waking up before sunrise so that one day, this exact moment could exist. But she made one mistake. She never looked up to see who was walking through the front doors behind her. Because in less than 5 minutes, the CEO of that bank was going to walk in, see what she had done, and call this man, sir. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. So how does a man in a 20-year-old pickup truck end up holding a check worth $2 million? Why would a woman with a bank manager's badge decide, in the space of 10 seconds, that he couldn't possibly be telling the truth? And what does it say about the rest of us, if we're honest, that we've all made a version of that same judgment at least once in our lives? Stick with me through this one, because this isn't really a story about money. It's a story about what we see when we look at another human being, and what we choose to ignore. I want you to picture yourself in that lobby for a second. Would you have said something? Or would you have stayed quiet like everyone else did? Hold on to that question, because by the end of this story, I think it's going to hit different. His name was Daniel Reyes, and he was born in a small fishing village on the coast, the kind of place where the tide told you what time it was better than any clock could. His father was a fisherman who never owned much of anything, but he owned one belief that he passed down to his son like an heirloom. He used to say it while they mended nets together in the evening. Wealth can disappear overnight, Daniel. Character stays. Daniel was 19 when he left that village with one suitcase, a few $100s sewn into the lining of his jacket, and a promise to himself that he would never forget where he came from, no matter how far he traveled. He landed in California with nothing but a cousin's address written on a scrap of paper and a stubborn kind of hope that only young men carry. He worked construction sites in the summer heat, poured concrete until his hands cracked and bled, and at night he cleaned office buildings downtown, vacuuming carpets under fluorescent lights while the executives who worked there were home asleep. He never complained. He used to tell people later in life that the work didn't feel small to him, because every dollar he earned was a brick in something bigger, something he could see clearly even when nobody else could. That's where he met Grace. She worked the register at a small diner near his construction site, and Daniel came in every single day for 2 years before he finally worked up the nerve to ask her to dinner. She said yes, and 6 months later, they were married in a small church with 12 people in the pews. Grace used to sew his work jackets herself, patch by patch, because store-bought ones never fit right and because, she said, she liked knowing her hands had touched everything he wore. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time someone loved you in a way that quiet, in a way that never needed an audience to be real? Daniel and Grace never had children of their own, but they built a life around a simple, disciplined rule. Live on less than you earn, and invest the difference. While their neighbors bought new cars and bigger televisions, Daniel put small amounts into modest, steady investments, month after month, year after year, never chasing anything flashy, never gambling on anything he didn't understand. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody threw him a parade for it. But compound growth doesn't care about being noticed. It just quietly does its work in the dark, the same way Daniel did. Grace passed away 11 years ago, after a long illness that Daniel never talks about in much detail, even now. What he does talk about is the jacket. He never bought a new one after she died. Every stitch she'd sewn into it still held, and every time he put it on, it was like carrying a small piece of her with him. That jacket is important. Remember it, because it becomes the whole reason everything in this story goes so wrong before it goes right. By the time Daniel turned 64, his quiet investments had grown into something he never could have imagined as a young man mending nets on that shoreline. But he never moved into a bigger house. He never bought the car. He kept driving the same pickup truck with the sun-faded paint and the cracked side mirror, because comfort had never been the point. The point, he decided, was what came next. He wanted to open a scholarship fund for young Filipino students, kids who reminded him of himself at 19, kids who had the hope but not yet the chance. That $2 million check wasn't for himself at all. It was the first deposit into somebody else's future. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Daniel put on that same stitched jacket, folded the cashier's check carefully into a worn leather folder, and drove his pickup truck to Grand Crest National Bank downtown. It was a branch he'd never used before, closer to the office of the nonprofit he was setting the scholarship fund up with. He walked in expecting what anyone expects walking into a bank. A form to fill out, a few minutes of waiting, a simple deposit. A young teller named Sophia Bennett greeted him warmly at the counter. She was new, still learning the systems, still the kind of employee who smiled at every customer regardless of what they were wearing. She took one look at the check, saw the number on it, and her eyes widened slightly. Standard procedure for a check that size meant a manager's sign-off, so she politely asked Daniel to wait while she called someone over. Daniel nodded, unbothered. He'd sat through plenty of paperwork in his life. That's when Rebecca Collins, the branch manager, walked over. She glanced at the check, then at Daniel, then back at the check, and something in her expression shifted. She asked him where the funds came from. He told her, calmly, that they were personal investment proceeds, intended for a scholarship fund. She asked again, this time with an edge in her voice, like she was testing him, like she expected him to trip over his own story. He didn't. He answered the same way the second time as he had the first. Rebecca turned the check over in her hands, studying it the way you'd study something you'd already decided was fake before you even looked closely. This account doesn't look right to me, she said. Sophia, standing nearby, gently mentioned that the account information had come back verified on her screen just a moment earlier. Rebecca ignored her. She looked at Daniel's jacket, at the faded stitching Grace had sewn by hand more than a decade ago, at his work boots, at his hands, rough and calloused from 40 years of labor, and she made her decision before either of them said another word. People like you don't carry checks like this, she said, loud enough that the entire lobby turned to look. A few customers near the door stopped what they were doing. Someone near the entrance quietly pulled out their phone. Daniel felt his face grow warm, not with anger exactly, but with something older and heavier, a feeling he'd carried more than once in his life and had hoped, at 64, he was finally past. He asked her, calmly, to please verify the account one more time, to call the issuing bank directly if she needed to. Instead, Rebecca tore the check in half. The lobby went completely silent. Sophia's mouth actually fell open. An older woman near the customer service desk gasped audibly. Daniel stood there for a long moment, looking down at the two halves of paper on the marble floor, representing not just money, but 11 years of disciplined investing, 40 years of labor, and a scholarship fund that dozens of kids were counting on, even though they didn't know it yet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the pieces on the floor. He simply looked at Rebecca and said, quietly enough that only the people closest could hear, you didn't just destroy a check. You destroyed your own career. Rebecca laughed, short and sharp, and reached for the phone to call security. I want you to sit with that moment for a second. If you were Daniel standing there, humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, what would you have done? Would you have kept your composure the way he did? Or would something inside you have broken right there on that marble floor? Let me know in the comments, because I think the honest answer says a lot about who we are. If this part is making sense, drop a comment with, I'm still here, so we know who's watching all the way through. Security never actually made it to the counter, because at that exact moment, the front doors opened and David Harrison, the CEO of Grand Crest National Bank, walked in for what was supposed to be a routine branch visit. He wasn't expecting a scene. He was expecting a quiet Tuesday morning of checking in on staff and reviewing quarterly numbers with the branch team. What he saw instead stopped him cold. Two torn pieces of a cashier's check on the floor. A room full of silent, uncomfortable customers. And an elderly man in a familiar stitched jacket standing perfectly still, dignity intact, while Rebecca Collins stood behind the counter with a phone in her hand. David's eyes moved from the torn check, to Rebecca, and finally to Daniel's face. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recognition that made his voice drop when he finally spoke. "Mr. Reyes," he said. "I had no idea you were visiting this branch today." The entire lobby went quiet in a completely different way now. Sophia looked between David and Daniel, trying to piece together what she was missing. Rebecca's confident posture wavered slightly, the phone lowering from her ear. David crossed the lobby and extended his hand to Daniel, who shook it without a word. Then David bent down, picked up both halves of the torn check from the floor, and held them carefully, almost reverently, like he understood exactly what they represented even before anyone explained it to him. David turned to Rebecca, his voice calm but firm. "Did you verify the account before you did this?" Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "I could tell it was fake," she said. "Look at how he's dressed. Nobody walks in here with $2 million looking like that." David shook his head slowly. "No. You didn't judge the check. You judged him. And you were wrong on both counts." He turned to face the rest of the lobby, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. He explained that 11 years ago, during the bank's darkest financial period, when 3 other branches in the region had already closed their doors, Daniel Reyes had been one of a small handful of long-term investors whose steady, unglamorous capital had helped keep this particular branch solvent through the worst of it. Daniel had never asked for recognition. He'd never wanted his name on a plaque or a press release. He simply kept showing up, kept investing quietly, kept believing in something most people had already given up on. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Somewhere behind the counter, another employee who had witnessed the entire exchange lowered her head, embarrassed for her manager. Ask yourself, if you found out tomorrow that someone you dismissed and mocked had quietly been holding your entire world together, how would that sit with you? I think most of us would struggle to live with that. Rebecca was terminated before the end of that same day. Bank policy on customer treatment left no room for negotiation, and David made it clear this wasn't a difficult decision for him. As she gathered her things to leave, she turned to Daniel, her voice smaller now than it had been an hour earlier, and told him she was sorry. Daniel looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to tired understanding. "I accept your apology," he said. "Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It just stops hatred from creating new ones." 6 months later, Grand Crest National Bank rolled out a new mandatory training program across every branch, focused entirely on dignity, respect, and unconscious bias in customer treatment. Sophia was promoted into a supervisory role, in part because of the quiet integrity she'd shown that morning, refusing to look away even when it would have been easier to. And Daniel Reyes went back to his life exactly as it had been before. The same modest home. The same pickup truck with the cracked side mirror. The same jacket, stitched by hands that were no longer with him, still worn every single day. The scholarship fund was fully established within the year, and it now carries Grace's name instead of his own. He still visits her grave every week with fresh flowers, and he says the same thing to her every time. That he kept the promise. That the kids from villages just like his are getting the chance he almost didn't get. He lost nothing that truly mattered that morning. If anything, he found out exactly who he still was, even when someone tried to convince a room full of strangers otherwise. Never measure a person's worth by what they're wearing, by the car they drive, or by how tired their hands look. Measure it by the character they show when the world hands them every reason to become bitter, and they choose kindness instead. I want you to think about someone in your own life right now who might be quietly carrying more dignity, more strength, and more sacrifice than you've ever given them credit for. Maybe it's time to look at them a little differently. What's your take on this story? Would you have reacted the way Daniel did, or would it have broken you? Comment below, I read every single one. If this story moved you even a little, hit the like button and send it to someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching.